A country that was victorious in a conflict with the enemy had not only displayed more bravery and higher skills on the battlefield, but must be more convinced of the ideology it was fighting for. The spirit of the people was high, and everybody hoped that the final victory would be in the near future. Nationalism and communism were two opposing ideologies. Long before anybody was aware of it, Hitler had sensed the danger of communism not only for Germany or Europe, but for the whole world. In modern history classes, we had long discussions about the subject. Stalin had killed or starved to death millions of his own people. Our teacher showed us pictures taken by the German army as they discovered mass graves of Polish officers who were shot by Russian firing squads and buried by the thousands in the forest of Katyn. We had also seen in the newsreel how the Russian people by the roadside greeted the German troops with flowers and refreshments. For them, we arrived as their liberators from Stalin's tyranny. It also explained why, in the first month, the Russian army mostly surrendered with very little resistance. In the beginning, Stalin could not counterattack as he had eliminated most of his senior officers. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the invasion of Russia, was a successful surprise attack. The fighting units advanced faster as expected, and keeping them supplied turned out to be a problem. The legend of Germany invading an unprepared Soviet Union was a myth that was refutable. Several high-ranking Russian officers after their capture had stated that Stalin also planned an invasion of Germany. The only reason that Germany attacked first was the fact that Stalin was not ready to attack. As early as the spring of 1940, a few months after the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union, Stalin already started to make preparation for the invasion of Germany scheduled for September 1941. By the order of Stalin, the generals Zhukov and Timoshenko submitted a plan whereby Soviet armies would, from the West Ukraine, advance into Silesia and secure the Krakow-Breslau area. Then Soviet forces would push north to reach the Baltic Sea in an attempt to confine the German armies in Poland and East Prussia in an encircling battle. The operation was to be carried out as a surprise attack without a declaration of war. The whole plan was nothing but an operation on paper. It never materialized as the German government acted faster than the Soviet Union and turned the Red Army into chaos. Not quite convinced about the validity of the story, I asked the teacher, "How do we know that the prisoners are telling us the truth?" The teacher replied, "It more or less does coincide with the information obtained by our own secret agents. There are certain facts that speak for themselves. Let's look at some statistics that don't lie. At normal times, the Soviet Union maintained an army of not more than 1.9 million men. By introducing compulsory military service, the Red Army increased by July 1, 1940, to 3.6 million men, by January 1 to 4.2 million s, and had reached on July 1, 1941, a maximum capacity of 5 million men. In 1939, the Russian army had only 58 divisions, and by early 1941 the number increased to 303 infantry, panzer, and motorized divisions. For an underdeveloped country like Russia, it made no sense to maintain such a big army unless the ruler of the nation had some conquering in mind. Our days here at school kept us very much occupied and exercised and also isolated from the rest of the world. The only connection we had with the outside were the radio, letters from home, and a day off to go to town every other Sunday. The bad news about the first air raid of the year in Berlin on the 13th of March had us guys from Berlin pretty scared. Schöneberg and Wilmersdorf were the main targets of the British bombers. Then again, on the 23rd of March, they bombed downtown Berlin. I was relieved to know that my parents were out of danger as Tegel had not been attacked, but I was worried about Gisela since she was now living in Wilmersdorf. She must have known about my anxiety because she wrote me immediately that she, her parents, and their home were unharmed. On the 6th of April, the German army invaded Yugoslavia and Greece. Our history teacher told us that we had no choice. German intelligence had found out that the British made preparation to occupy these two countries. Once more, the British suffered a defeat. I had a feeling that out of revenge, the RAF launched another attack in Berlin 3 days later during the night from the 9th to the 10th of April. This particular air raid was the first attack to destroy a historical landmark. The Stadt Soper unter den Linden, built by the famous architect Knobelsdorff, burned completely to the ground. On Easter Sunday, a furlough was given for everybody in our school for the weekend, unless you were assigned for guard duty. Most of us were too far from home and had time only to go to town or visit the nearby lake. It was a chance for us to explore Nice and see what was going on Saturday night in town. On Sunday morning, I had the urge to go to church, partly because it was Easter Sunday, and also I needed to pray for my parents, family and friends living in constant danger in Berlin. I did not feel any conflict of interest between nationalism and religion. Both were diverse and presented many forms of goodness in their fields. The church had given me all the basic values of morality and spiritual strength when I needed it. The state educated me for citizenship, made me aware of my mission, urged me to unity, and harmonized in the interest of human solidarity. Socialism and nationalism were unique and original creations. The new state was not reactionary but revolutionary, for it anticipated the solution of political problems without parties, parliaments, and the irresponsibility of assemblies. Democracy and liberalism spelled individualism. Nationalism spelled collectivism based on solid foundation of popular support. As a total surprise, it was announced on the radio that Germany attacked Russia in the morning hours of June 22nd. The victories over the Russian army were staggering. After advancing hundreds of miles, the German armies were rapidly approaching Moscow and Leningrad. The fields of the Ukraine were quickly overrun by German panzer divisions. The military authorities in Berlin, London, and Washington believed that the Soviet Union was finished. Never before had Germany in all its history in any war gained so much territory. As a new and powerful nation, the German people had also, as never before since the dark days of 1918, regained pride and self-esteem. Unemployment was virtually non-existent, and considering all the sacrifices needed for the war effort, the standard of living was relatively high. Our classroom had a big map of Russia on the wall, and every time our school received some news from the battlefront, we followed up the events of major advances of our armies by putting little flags on a pin as marker on the map to establish a line of the battlefront. The war went on, and more men were drafted to follow the call of duty. To replace them, women and the Hitler Youth had to take their places in factories and farms. This year, all students had to pitch in to secure the harvest at the school farms. As a result, our summer vacation was postponed by 1 month. It was fun for us even if it was hard work, but it gave us great pleasure when we came back and enjoyed the swimming pool in the evening. Finally, on August 15th, the school closed, and everybody was going home on vacation. To my surprise, when I arrived in Tegel, my parents had not yet come back from their vacation. I relaxed for 2 days. Then I went to visit my grandparents. They were both doing fine, and they were very happy to see me. Since they were living in Schöneberg, which was close to Wilmersdorf, I took the opportunity to go over and visit Gisela. Her parents were not home either, but the two of us had a lot to talk about, and we had to decide how we would spend our few days together. Meanwhile, my parents returned from their trip, and they told me what a wonderful time they had in Austria and how nice it was to get out of the city. The few days out of the year that I was spending with my parents were suddenly interrupted on the night of September 7, 1941, by a British air raid over Berlin. It was the first major air raid for me, and I jumped about a foot high out of bed when unexpectedly the screaming noise of the nearby siren went off at 2 o'clock in the morning. For me, it was a new experience, but my parents went already through it several times. You get immediately dressed, take your bags, food container, drinking water, and a flashlight. After you turn off the lights, leave the house unlocked and proceed without delay to the nearest shelter. As described in the previous chapter, most houses in Berlin were built with underground basements, which were converted into air raid shelters. This was done by sandbagging the windows, putting in steel doors to the outside and to the next door basement, making it possible to escape from one shelter to another. More important than anything else was the reinforcement of the ceiling supported by heavy vertical beams. If a house was hit by a bomb and everything was destroyed above ground, the weight of falling walls was tremendous and must be supported by the ceiling of the basement. The inside of the shelter was primitive but functional. Bunk beds, tables, and benches were the basic furniture. Gas masks, firefighting equipment, medical supplies, and provisions were also part of the inventory. As soon as the last tenant arrived, the steel doors were closed shut, and I could not fight off an oncoming feeling of claustrophobia. A few minutes later, a formation of British bombers crossed Tegel, approaching their targets in East Berlin. All of a sudden, hell broke loose. 2 blocks from us was a large vacant field, where every year the circus would come and put up a tent and park all their vehicles for the animals, equipment trailer, and mobile homes for the entertainers. Well, tonight it was a different kind of circus. I could not sneak in or out under the bottom of a circus tent. I was trapped behind steel doors in an air raid shelter. Where the circus used to be was now a permanent parking place for a battery of 6 88mm flak, anti-aircraft guns, and 48 in searchlights. The moment they all started firing at the same time, it sounded like bombs were exploding over our heads. Women got hysterical, and children cried in the shelter. The terrific noise and the constant vibration made us believe we were under direct attack. The air raid warden tried to calm everybody down, explaining to us what really went on and that we were out of danger. The whole thing lasted not more than 10 minutes, but it seemed like hours. Coming out of the shelter, we could see in an easterly direction large, bright orange-red fire clouds over Berlin. As we found out the next morning, Lichtenberg and Pankow suffered severe fire damage caused by thousands of Brandbomben, phosphorus bombs. The Potsdamer Platz, the main traffic artery downtown, was also the target of several bombs. Nearby, at the Paris Ehrplatz, a 1,800 kilograms Luftmine, heavy bomb exploding above ground, killed dozens of people. Air raids were now becoming a new chapter in the history of warfare. The attacks were not always against factories and military installations. Most of the time, the targets were the civilian population. The enemy was trying to win the war by terrifying and demoralizing unarmed women and children. It made no difference if the killing took place in London or Berlin. The people would not be pressed into submission. In a way, I was glad that my parents were now living outside of Berlin, thinking that Tegel might be less of a target for the British. To be on the safe side, my father suggested to start taking things we valued in several trips to Kremen and storing them in the attic of Aunt Erna's house in the country. Just a few days before the end of my summer vacation, we went out of Berlin to Aunt Erna's. It was nice to be together again after we had not seen each other for over a year. Cousin Ingeborg said that we must all come back and celebrate Christmas together in Kremen. Everybody agreed, but in the meanwhile, I had to go back to Nysa for the last 3 months of my school year. Our curriculum had not changed very much, except that Greek mythology had been added to the schedule. The traditions and legends of the Greek people, which are embodied in their beliefs concerning their origin, gods and heroes, were very inspiring. The commanding courage of Hector and Achilles in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey animated our current struggle for survival. The Battle of Troy was a parallel of our times. The death of a hero dying for his country was the most admirable and supreme sacrifice. Dulce et decorum pro patria mori. How sweet and beautiful it is to die for one's country. None of us young teenagers wanted to die, but all of us were willing to fight no matter what the consequences. Maybe one of these days there would be peace on earth. The world over, people were celebrating Christmas, praying for peace. And it was not any different this year, except that the war was constantly intensifying. Once more the school was closed over the Christmas and New Year holidays, and as I was sitting in the train going home, these things were going through my mind. For many people, Christmas was no longer a religious festival, but rather a convenient occasion to take a break from whatever they were doing, to relax and indulge in food and drinks. On Christmas Eve, my parents and I arrived in Kremen to be with Aunt Erna and Ingeborg as we'd promised. At midnight we attended the service at the little Lutheran church in Kremen. Being in the country among farmers, wearing civilian clothes and not surrounded by cadets in grey uniforms, I felt like being in a different world. What would my life be if I could just be an ordinary 12-year-old boy in a peaceful Germany? Folks living in the country had not been touched by the war, yet they also had not seen any shortage of food. On Christmas Day, we exchanged a few small gifts, but enjoyed mostly being with each other. For Ingeborg, I had a big surprise. She had always wanted a bicycle, and since I no longer had use for mine, I decided to give it to her. She was very happy and tried it out immediately. Aunt Erna's parents had a big farm near Schwerin in Mecklenburg, and kept her supplied with smoked ham and sausages. When we returned to Tegel, Berlin, Aunt Erna gave my mother some ham and salami to take home, which we gratefully accepted. To celebrate the new year, we were invited to my grandmother's house. My grandmother's second husband, whom I sometimes called grandfather, was an old winemaking buff, and he was very good at his hobby. His favourite pursuit was a tasteful and pleasing elderberry wine. He was friendly and good to me, and for the occasion, he insisted that my parents allow me to enjoy a few sips of his savoury creation. My grandmother, as always, with whatever little she had, managed to put a wonderful meal together. Some of the ham and salami we received from Aunt Erna we shared with them. On January 3rd, 1942, it was time again for me to return to school. The academy by now was my primary home, and I had found my purpose in life, and I was embracing all the opportunities the academy had to offer. The LBA NISA had strong connections to all activities and courses the government had to offer to sponsor the Hitler Youth. One of these organizations was the NSKK, the National Socialist Automobile Corps. It was a motorsport group engaging in racing motorcycles and operating all kinds of cars, trucks, and tanks. One day in school, 2 officers of the NSKK came to visit our class to give us an introduction to the organization and showed us a film about all the different activities. It aroused my interest since I always wanted to ride a motorcycle. I signed up, and it gave me a chance twice a week in the afternoon to go to NISA and join the group. Riding a motorcycle is basically the same as riding a bicycle. Once you are able to coordinate clutch and gears, a full throttle will give you a speed you can only dream about sitting on a bicycle. Everyone's goal in the group was to eventually get a driver's license. Theoretical and technical courses were a prerequisite along with driver's education. During the war, the minimum age for a driver's license had been lowered to the age of 14. Under the age of 14, boys who were members of the Hitler Youth NSKK were used as motorcycle couriers attached to the police or any branch of the armed forces. Still, every day in class, we listened to the report of the OKW, the High Command of the Army, and adjusted the lines on the map according to troop advances. This week in June was the anniversary of Germany's first attack on Russia, and the Führer's headquarters had the lessons of the first year's victories and failures to help them in making their second-year plans. This week, the clock struck. The time for Germany's great attempt to crush Russia had come. The Führer had no second year in which to conquer Russia. He had at most 4 months, perhaps only 3, during which Russia must be conquered or the war would be dragged out and become a burden. From the Führer's standpoint, Russia must be liquidated as an enemy before the United States could throw its real weight into the war. Germany must beat Russia in time to allow the German war machine to turn and meet the enemy in the West. As our history teacher pointed out to us, we could not afford to make the mistake again we did in WWI by getting tied up in a 2-front war and split our fighting power in half. The basic facts were known as our High Command sat down to plan the German campaign of 1942. This time they had to pin down the Russian army in order to crush it, for the Russians could even retreat 1,000 miles without even reaching the Ural industrial area. To push an army away without destroying it stretches your supply lines and leaves your flanks open for a counterattack. To crush the Russian army, the German troops had to be free to attack along the whole 2,000-mile battlefront. For this, we had to wait for good weather. Not until the end of June could the ground be counted on to be fit and hard in the north around Leningrad and in the Ukraine. With this starting time limit and the necessity of finishing before another winter, the General Staff had to devise a plan for crushing Russia in a few months' time, a campaign as crushing as those against Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, a campaign better than the blitzkrieg that failed against Russia in 1941. This had to be the greatest thunderbolt of all, and it had to strike on time. Failure would most certainly be loss of the war, but the prize of success would be freedom to turn the German Wehrmacht loose on Britain and the United States, probably to take all of Asia, possibly to take most of Africa, and perhaps to take Britain itself. It would be exciting to see how the strategy would develop in the next few months. It was also obvious that this summer the world would witness the biggest tank battle in history. The day was July 19th, 1942. It was my 13th birthday, and I was celebrating this day away from home without my family. I was now a teenager, a step closer to adulthood in age. But in reality, all of us youngsters were growing up a lot faster these days, and the circumstances obligated us to act as adults. My parents sent me a letter with a nice birthday card. They also mailed me 20 marks, and my mother enclosed some coupons for bread or bakery goods out of their own restricted food rations. With these food stamps and some spending money in my pocket, I asked my friend Helmut to come along and celebrate my birthday with me. Helmut was a fellow cadet who came from Schulzendorf, a little village next to Tegel. We got acquainted at a Hitler Youth meeting, not knowing that we would be classmates in Nysa. He also joined the motorsport group in town, and today we left early. The most part of downtown Nysa was called the Ring. As the name implied, it was a huge circle of beautiful houses, stores, and restaurants. In the middle was the plaza, which was more like an open park with Sacred Heart, the oldest church in Nysa. Another landmark at the Ring was the Café Heimatland, which had a pastry shop and an ice cream parlour. The corner was a preferred hangout place of most cadets on their days off, especially the seniors who came here with their girlfriends. Today, I was the big spender. Helmut and I sat in the garden under a big chestnut tree, and we were enjoying the specialty of the house, marzipan and mocha torte with a schlag and vanilla ice cream on the side. While enjoying this wonderful treat, we had a nice conversation and started to talk about our upcoming summer vacation and what we were planning to do with our days at home. Well, I said, besides visiting friends and relatives, I like to spend as much time as I could on the lake in Tegel. I had not been sitting in a kayak for a long time. Helmut was telling me that he felt the same way, and that he would take out his parents' motorboat every time he had a chance to use it. We had the boat tied down on the River Havel, not too far from where we lived. Of course, he kept on saying, "You are more than welcome to join me any time you feel like it." "It is a deal," I said. "I will take you up on it when the time comes." And time would come soon for our summer vacation. In less than 2 weeks, school would close on July 31st and would open again on September 16th. Today was the 22nd of July, the anniversary of Germany's first attack on Russia 13 months earlier. Our history teacher, Colonel Kluger, was the chief officer of a regiment fighting the Russians in WW1. He knew all about strategy, and he was an expert of warfare and daily facts and figures on our map, and in reality could not escape him. Relating to statistics and information we received, he could very much describe what had happened and predict the move our army would make. As it stood 13 months after the outbreak of war with Russia, our army had only occupied about 7%, some 580,000 square miles, of Russia's land, but we had not conquered Russia. We had destroyed or captured upward of 4.5 million Red soldiers, 15,000 Red tanks, and 9,000 Red planes. But we had not destroyed the Red Army. German artillerymen could see Leningrad through their telescopes, but they had not captured Leningrad, a city we had to take in order to cut off the enemy's Murmansk supply route coming from the Baltic. To end the war for us in victory, it was absolutely essential to capture Moscow immediately. According to Kluger, it was more important to attack Moscow, the heart and capital of the USSR with its vast railway system that rayed out from Moscow and served most of Russia, than try to go for the oil in the Caucasus and besiege the fortress of Sevastopol, which controlled the Black Sea. German armies were poised on the outer borders of the industrial Donets basin, but they did not have its mines, power plants and factories, or its roads to Caucasian oil. With the limited time available for reaching these goals, Germany must make all possible preparations in advance before the start of the offensive. All along the 2,000-mile front, from Murmansk to the Sea of Azov, innumerable local chores of the war had been done. Contrary to Kluger, our Führer decided to take Sevastopol, not Moscow. The question at Sevastopol was not whether we could take it, but how much we could afford to pay for it. Here was the situation the way a Red soldier captured by the Germans described it. Now at Sevastopol there is no air fit to breathe because of the decaying bodies of German, Russian and Romanians. The Führer wanted Sevastopol, not only for great strategic reasons, but because he particularly needed it as a triumph to stiffen the morale of the German Palo for the great campaign to come. The German armies were ready, yet the spectacle of death at Sevastopol was only the overture for what was to come. In spirit, in the will to win or die, the German army had no superior. Just how it stood in effective numbers and vital weapons, only the German High Command knew. Within broad limits, the general strength and distribution of the German armies were estimated in the following sectors. 1. On the northern front, from Murmansk to Staraya Russa, below Leningrad, nearly 1 million men in 35 German divisions, including 3 panzers, 12 Finn divisions, 2 Italian divisions too. On the central front, Moscow, Kalinin, Rzhev, Vyazma, Bryansk, over 850,000 men in 40 German divisions, including 4 panzers, 2 Italian divisions, and 1 Spanish 3. On the southern front, Kharkov to the Crimea, about 1.3 million men in 50 German divisions, including 8 panzers, 14 Romanian, and 2 Italian divisions 4. In reserve, in the occupied Ukraine, White Russia, the Baltic, Poland, East Prussia, more than 1.5 million men in 70 German divisions, including at least 4 panzers and probably more, 6 Romanian, and 4 Italian divisions 5. In the Luftwaffe, now mainly in the south, about 6,000 frontline planes in 3 air fleets of 2,000 each. The sad part of the first year's war in Russia were the 1.5 million casualties Germany had to pay for the invasion. The plan was ready. The spirit of the German soldiers was unbroken, and they would fight desperately, knowing that Germany would lose everything, at least in their generation's lifetime, unless they won. Gigantic problems were now facing the German army. The enemy had lines of prepared defences in the rear, blocking every mile of the primary roads to Moscow and the objectives in the north and south. Against such defences, the typical blitz, the quick shock, the breakthrough, the spearing advance by planes, tanks, and mobile artillery, then the follow-up by infantry, would not serve as it did in Poland, in the lowlands, and in Russia's first months. Now, in depth and thorough preparation, the Russian defences were stronger than those that slowed the German drive last fall, then stopped it with winter's paralysing help. But if Stalin and his staff had learned how to crack the 1940 model Blitz, Germany's generals had had many months to study Soviets' defence. Moscow's hard-headed commanders could only assume that the Germans had a plan, that the plan was ready, and that it was in scale with the German task. The German armies, in their preparatory spring attacks, had already shown a few new tricks. Essence of these new tactics was to choose a very narrow sector, smash the selected area with a maximum concentration of planes. The Russians counted 1,000 on a 15-mile line below Kharkov, then strike with closely integrated formations of artillery, infantry, and tanks. Full-strength panzers had not attempted to dart through the enemy lines, swirled at will in the Russian rear. Instead, the Germans apparently kept their tanks in smaller groups, close to artillery and infantry. Thus, while the German pace might be slow, it was calculated to keep concentrated columns intact, always with enough strength to protect themselves from the surrounding Russians. At Kharkov, these tactics worked so well that Moscow had to admit a continued German advance. At Sevastopol, the Germans' brute concentration of men and metal brought that fortress to the verge of collapse in 16 days. It was possible that the recent variations of German tactics had been merely a change of pace, perhaps partly caused by the desire to concentrate tanks. Considering the size of the battlefield, and the size of the Russian armies and the tendency shown in every pre-Vyas campaign in WW2 for the Führer to lay plans on a grand scale, the German plan for 1942 might well call for breakthroughs and encirclements on a huge scale. There were many opportunities for such attacks. A major drive in the centre might take Moscow and, sweeping on, outflank the entire southern front. A major drive in the south might strike directly at the Caucasus, or swing north to outflank the central front. A drive in the far north might cut the lines of Allied aid from Murmansk and Archangel. A major drive through or around Turkey might cut off the Russian backdoor through Persia or swing south to attack Suez. There were possible variations upon these themes. Several such drives might be launched at once, some of them real, some feints. Any 2 adjoining drives could be come-a-pincer movement. Whatever the plan, it was certain to be breathtaking. The Führer told the German army, the Air Force, and the Navy where to fight. Sometimes he told them when to fight, but the High Command and his small, thoroughly professional group of generals told them how to fight. Up to now, in WW2, the product of General Franz Halder's planning had always been a thunderbolt, the lightning that withered Poland, Norway, Holland, Belgium and France, the shaft that staggered Russia last year. Thunderbolts should strike on time. The Führer's time in Russia, his only time, was now. The world had a right to expect something terrific, and our teacher said the German people should expect more days of glory ahead. These were the strategies we discussed with Colonel Kluger, and only history would tell the eventual outcome of the conflict. Finally, the day had come when school closed down for the summertime, and everybody was heading for home. At 11 p.m. on August 1st, I arrived in Tegel. I was very tired, and after greeting my parents and after a short conversation, my mother urged me to go to bed. The next day, after a good night's sleep, we had a lot to talk about. Somehow I noticed that my parents appeared kind of depressed. I asked them if there was something bothering them, and my father told me what was upsetting them. Unexpectedly, my father received a draft notice for the Air Force on July 30th to report for military duty on August 12th at the Hermann Göring Air Force Base in Spandau. I was devastated with the news. Not that I was afraid my father would not be a good soldier, but I could not see my parents being separated from each other. All I could do at this moment was try to cheer them up by saying that the war would be over soon, and Dad would be back in no time at all. Deep down in my mind, I was not too convinced of what I was saying, but I ignited a glimmer of hope in my parents' eyes. As always, in the short time we had together, the days were filled with visits to relatives and friends. They said hello to me and goodbye to my father, who was departing in a few days, shipping off to be stationed at the Hungarian front. The Air Force base in Spandau, where he was to report, was only 30 minutes by bus from Tegel. In the morning, my grandparents came for an early visit to see us before my dad had to check in at 1600 hours. We had plenty of time for a nice lunch and a beer at the nearest pub. My grandfather, an old veteran, had plenty of advice to give my father on how to survive the war. When the bus came, both my mother and my grandmother cried at the last goodbye. On the way home, my mother told me how afraid she would be in a few weeks when I would be going back to Nice. To make her feel better, I told my mother, "Mom, a friend at school, also from Berlin, whose mother is all by herself, got a transfer to the LBA Brandenburg. If they also allow me to transfer, then I can be with you every weekend." My mother said, however, that she would be fine, and I should not leave the academy if I liked it there. "The only time I feel alone is at those terrible air raids. It is a most dreadful experience, like nothing in my whole life," my mother said. I tried to change the subject, but in my heart I was fearing for her safety. As a grim reminder of the war, my mother and I spent 4 frightful nights together in the basement shelter during my summer vacation. On August 27th, the targets were Zehlendorf and Kreuzberg, and 2 days later Kreuzberg, Tempelhof, Tiergarten, Lichtenberg and Treptow. Again, on September 9th, Soviet planes attacked Mahlsdorf and Weissensee, and on the 11th, the RAF bombarded Berlin with 33 planes. After that, Berlin was left without any more attacks for the rest of the year. The reason behind it was simple. The British had overextended their air raids, and whatever planes they had left, they were using them for a new strategy by concentrating their attacks more on West Germany, especially on the Rhineland, where all the heavy industry was located. After the air raid, I had to go and see Gisela. She lived in the area that got hit the most. Gisela and her mother were not hurt, but the roof of their house was hit by 2 of those small firebombs. Luckily, the Hitler Youth Bucket Brigade came and extinguished the fire before it could burn down the house. Firebombs were approximately 3 by 24-inch hexagon aluminum container filled with a highly inflammable yellowish phosphorus substance that exploded and ignited on impact. The average airplane could carry up to 1,000 of those tiny bombs and were designed to inflame and burn down highly populated cities. Once a part of town was burning, the fire created its own heat and wind, could no longer be controlled, and would spread all over town. It was useless to try to put out a fire started by a firebomb. In order to keep on burning, it needed oxygen, and only sand would retard the fire. A house was a lot safer from firebombs if there was plenty of sand available in the attic beneath the roof. Gisela and I went down the street, and as we were walking through the neighborhood, Gisela showed me some houses completely destroyed, and some were still burning. Everywhere people were carrying furniture or trying to salvage some of their belongings. When I asked Gisela about her father, She told me that he was also drafted recently and was currently fighting in Russia. Many women were now living without a husband or alone with their children. I told Gisela that I considered, because of my mother being alone, a transfer next school year to the LBA Brandenburg. She did not say anything, but the possibility of me coming home made her happy and the farewell at the end of my vacation easier. Before I departed for Nice, I did encourage my mother to live with Erna and Ingeborg in the country, as my father earlier suggested, to escape the danger of becoming an air raid victim. My mother did not answer me, but 2 weeks after I went back to school, I received a letter from her telling me that she had taken a full-time job at Borsig as an assembly line worker for pieces of machinery. The war was no longer proceeding in a blitzkrieg manner, but victories were still reported. Germany was concentrating on reaching superiority over the enemy by developing new wonder weapons. Our class burst out in jubilation when the radio announced the first successful launch of a long-range missile by the German scientist Wernher von Braun on October 15th in Peenemünde. At the end of December this year, we were only getting a short Christmas vacation of 10 days, just enough to visit my mother and celebrate the holidays with my grandparents. For the new year, we were invited to stay with Erna and Ingeborg. Of course, the day before I left, I stopped by to see Gisela and her mother. They were both doing fine and were happy to see me. Since the last time I was in Berlin, there were no air raids, and all of us were hoping that the British were running out of steam. Living in an illusion that we had seen the end of air raids over Berlin, I decided to stay in Nice. The new school semester started, but on January 17, 1943, Berlin was again another target of the RAF. This time they came with 111 airplanes, concentrating their attack in Dahlem, the place where I was born, in Tempelhof, and even Tegel. The damage was extensive, and it was now clear to me that we were in for hard times. To confirm my suspicion, on February 18th, Dr. Goebbels, the German Minister of Propaganda, asked the Berliners at a rally in the Sport Palace if they would accept a total war. The response, even as we lost Stalingrad, could only be described as a definite yes in a spontaneous outbreak of anger against the enemy. As a result, every person in Germany was now expected in one form or another to contribute to the war effort, and the Hitler Youth was no exception. A week after Goebbels' speech, an emergency act proposed by the Ministry of War was signed by Adolf Hitler into law, declaring to draft all male students 14 years and over to serve as Flakhelfer near their high school, to help the regular crew of an anti-aircraft battery. At 13.5 years old, I volunteered for the military service like most of my fellow students at the academy. Our assignment was to attend a basic 7-month course after school at the Luftwaffe Air Force Base at the Talsperre near Nice. The Talsperre, Valley Dam, was the biggest water reservoir and hydropower plant in Upper Silesia. For the protection from the air, several .50 caliber and the famous 8.8 centimeters anti-aircraft guns were placed around the dam and its installation. The whole complex was surrounded by a chain-link fence with barbed wire on top and placed under 24 hours surveillance by MP guards with watchdogs. A big front gate was the only entrance where the guardhouse with the officer of the watch and his crew were located. Every person, employee or military going in or out must show proper identification. 2 lanes were installed only for the inspection of incoming and outgoing vehicles. The Air Force Base was located about 45 minutes from the LBA, and our school bus took us there every morning. One of the barracks at the base was converted into 2 classrooms. All newly inducted LUH, Luftwaffenhelfer, were receiving theoretic instruction before they were allowed to get near the flak for the first month. The next 3 months were a combination of classroom instruction and actual training at the battery side. Every gun had 1 crew, and every member of that crew functioned according to his assignment. It was all teamwork, and your position behind the battery was of equal importance. The heavy 318 flak battery consisted of 4 8.8 centimeters guns, some .50 caliber guns, and several 2 centimeters guns for the defense of nasty low-flying airplanes. For the Nice flak battery, his primary commission was to protect the Valley Dam with its hydropower plant, but its base also served as a training facility for the Air Force. Before we started our training, Each of us had to undergo a physical examination to make sure we were fit for pre-military service. Even though we were receiving special military training, we were not classified as regular combatants and officially were still members of the Hitler Youth. We were receiving the same meals as any other soldier, but when it came to rations of cigarettes and alcohol, we were going out empty as it was considered hazardous to our health. We had not received any Luftwaffe uniform yet, since we were considered only part-timers for 5 hours daily at the base. We were checking in at 9 in the morning and returned to the academy at 2 in the afternoon. In the afternoon, we still had about 3 hours of classes of our shared Yuled curriculum. Finally, the first month was now completed at the base, and the day we all had waited for so long had come. Our training at the battery side was now beginning. Each of us was now issued some overalls, a kind of fatigue dress especially designed for gun crews. The bunch from our school appearing at the base was a mixture of students ranging from 14 to 18 years of age. The oldest ones were selected for training at the guns to relieve a regular flak soldier that could be sent to the Russian front. The medium-aged group, if they were smart enough, were earmarked to operate optical and radar measuring instruments. The rest of the dummies, including me, got stuck in the Umwertung, revaluation. Normally, distance and position of enemy aircraft was given directly from the observation operator to the battery. In case of communication breakdown, the Umwertung would give any received data immediately to the battery. The Umwertung was located underground close to the battery, and the main function was to keep the regional Luftwaffe headquarters informed about position and amount of enemy airplanes. In the middle of the dugout was a huge map table of Germany, covered with a grid of map squares. Each province had its own map of grids, starting with the northwest corner being square A, going alphabetically and horizontally one letter for each square to the northeast corner. Back to the northwest corner, going vertically down alphabetically from A, with the next letter for each square to the southwest corner. Looking at the map of Brandenburg and locating the city of Berlin, you would find it in the square marked with the letters FG. The square below was marked GG. If I was in charge of the Umwertung, I would have to watch the map in front of me and report any movement of enemy aircraft to General Headquarters through my head speakers. A typical message would be like the following. Here is Kornblum. A bomber group of 6 Lancasters is leaving Friedrich Gustav, flying in a southerly direction approaching Gustav Gustav. I had no problem, and I was learning fast to be stationed in the Umwertung or be placed at observation. On a clear day, as shown in a slide projection, I could identify a bomber either as a Lancaster, Vickers Wellington, Halifax, B-17 or B-29. Low but fast-flying fighter planes I had to distinguish between Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt 109. Everything we had learned would now be put to the test by going through a series of simulated alarms of enemy air attacks. Such a drill would only be complete and successful if every member of the team performed correctly at the right time. All of us kids were getting along with the regular gun crew, and they were very patient with us if we didn't get it right the first or second time. In charge of the whole battery was a drill sergeant by the name Klotz. He was a non-commissioned officer next in rank to Captain Lehman, the CEO of the base. In command of our detail from the LBA was an 18-year-old senior student from Munich by the name Max. He was a husky boxer, and we nicknamed him Schmeling. Even Klotz called him Schmeling, and if something went wrong, he always let it out on him. There were altogether 4 seniors in our group, and each one of them was assigned as gun layout at the 4 8.8 centimetres flak at the battery. The rest of us had a less responsible position, but not a less important function to fulfill. One of the key elements, besides proper performance, was speed. The moment the siren went off like a lubricated lightning rushing out of the barracks, we were running as fast as we could either to the gun emplacement, dugout, or wherever our battle station was. In one of the first simulated alarms, the second oldest gun layout was so much in a hurry that he made a mistake. The captain of the battery gave the following orders: enemy bombing squadron at 180 degrees and Sperrfeuer at 1,000 meters. Sperrfeuer means box barrage, or call it an iron curtain of exploding shells. To accomplish that, all shells before being loaded manually must be set to explode at the same altitude. To activate the timing was a simple procedure. Around the tip of the shell was a device called Führungsring. a detonator ring with an adjustable time fuse to set the numbers for the shell to explode at a certain altitude. The mistake the cannoneer made was a wrong number. Instead of 1,000 meters, he skipped a 0 and turned the ring to 100 meters. For exercise purposes, we were not using live ammunition, or the battery would have been showered with bursting shell splinters. The only thing that rained down on us was the cussing of Drill Sergeant Klotz. To make matters worse, at the next exercise, I screwed up. As we were scrambling into position, I jumped inside the dugout, put on my earphones, and started to make a report to sign in. "This is Kornblum calling headquarters. Headquarters come in, over." There was no answer, so I repeated, "This is Kornblum calling headquarters. Headquarters come in, over." Before I could repeat my message, Sergeant Klotz was behind me and tipped me on my shoulder. I turned around, and there he was, holding with his other hand the plug at the end of the cord to my headgear. Red in the face, he pointed at the plug, speaking in a mad voice. "You might get a better reception if you plug it in." Klotz was trying to punish me, as he knew how much I liked my job in the Umwertung, by taking me out for another stupid assignment on the outside. From now on, I was what they called the birdie. During an alarm, everything was performed in a chain reaction. Even though it was only simulated, whatever you exercised was exactly the same thing you would do in a real air attack. The only thing that was missing was the enemy airplane. To correct the deficit, some genius had invented the birdie. Now everybody behind the gun sight of a flak had an object to aim at. The birdie was a little model airplane with an approximate wingspan of 12 inches with a 3 to 4 foot wire underneath attached to a 12-foot aluminum pole, which was held vertically up in the air. Somebody was holding the end of the stick, walking in a distance from 50 to 100 feet away, and around the battery to give every gunner a chance to shoot you down. I was the new dummy now to fly the birdie. The birdie I was flying was a B-24 Liberator. I was the pilot flying VFR, Visual Flight Rule, cruising around the battery trying to locate the lake 20 kilometers away from Nysa. I was flying low and turning the plane over to the bombardier to blow up the dam. No matter how much Klotz would chase us back and forth between barracks and battery, he could not break our spirits. After all, we were Hitler Youth, and this kind of grinding had made us tough. Klotz was a pugnacious fellow, but learned soon that we were able to endure hardship. One day, as we were not running fast enough, he stood in front of us and proclaimed, "We will practice this all day long till you clowns get the lead out." Well, enough was enough. Schmeling got really angry and told him in his heavy Bavarian accent, "Blow it out your arse." Klotz was shocked for a minute, turned closer to him and asked him calmly, "What did you say? Will you repeat that?" Schmeling did not move a muscle, looked straight into the eyes of Klotz, exclaiming slowly, "I said we are out of gas." All of us had a hell of a time not to crack up aloud in laughter, but none of us altered a tone of voice when we were spoken to. Suddenly, a sharp sound of a bell indicated that it was 2 in the afternoon, time to change uniforms and get back to the academy. On the bus, we finally let our emotions go, and Schmeling was the hero of the day. That day we were so tired, and some of us fell asleep in class. Most of us fellows from Berlin went to the director of the LBA Nysa and asked at the end of the semester to be transferred to the LBA Brandenburg. Concurrent with the completion of our 4-month training as Flakhelfer, in July we decided to be closer to the action in Berlin in case we were needed. In June, I also took my driver's test but was not issued a driver's license till July 19th, 1943, the day I turned 14 years old. I was granted the same month a transfer to the LBA Brandenburg, and at the beginning of the summer vacation said goodbye to the beloved school in Nysa forever.